So now we have Mary Hill from Cooney Lees Morgan, who's going to talk about RMA reforms.
Kia ora tātou, ko Mary Hill aho, he roia no Tauranga Moana. E tēnei wā ko au te tumuake o te kahui turi taiao. Kia ora everyone, I'm Mary Hill, I'm a lawyer based here in Tauranga Moana, and I'm currently the president of the Resource Management Law Association, which makes me reasonably well placed to briefly take you through the Randerson panel's proposal for reform of the resource management system, which of course includes landscape reform. I'm really going to make the case that this is not going to be a radical reorientation in relation to landscape, which I'm hoping will please these people over here, given the huge effort that they've just put into developing these guidelines, which are based on our current statutory context. My slides are at the very lower end of the aesthetically pleasing scale, and I've done that deliberately because I want you to focus on the content. So the Randerson Review Panel does recommend potentially significant changes for landscape, at first blush perhaps. So there's some questions that I've posed there, and I don't have the time to answer them, but they're things that it would be good for you to start turning your mind to. So a key issue will be, how will the Minister identify nationally significant landscapes, because that's going to be a matter that sits with the Minister for the Environment through national direction. How will the relationships of mana whenua with cultural landscapes be protected and restored? So there's two parts to that: protection and restoration. And we now have a defined, or we will have a defined concept of a cultural landscape. Is the removal of amenity considerations from Section 7 a substantive change? And also Gavin correctly mentioned that the definition of environment was very comprehensive under the current legislation, and that has been dramatically simplified under the proposed new Act that we'll have. But I don't think necessarily substantively. I think that's more of a process of simplification. And will existing case law inform or influence the new legislation that will be undermined by it? And we know that landscape is an area where there is a considerable body of, to use a fancy lawyer word, jurisprudence, which is really the body of case law that is developed that I know you as practitioners regularly refer to. So those are some of the issues that arise, or will arise. So what is proposed? The panel, so the Randerson Review Panel, which didn't have a landscape architect on it, although it was broadly represented by a number of other disciplines, they were all in agreement on some fundamentals, which is that landscapes involve both land use and environmental protection issues. And for that reason, the proposed approach will maintain the integrated approach to planning and environmental management. And there has been a bit of confusion, particularly around the media, the way that the media has portrayed the reform. So while we are going to have two key acts, the main one that replaces the RMA, which is the Natural and Built Environments Act, as its name suggests, is still going to deal holistically with both the natural and the built environment. And the key intention of the NBEA is that it will strengthen protection for a number of things, including landscape. There's also, so how is it going to do that? The main change to the current approach is to focus on outcomes. So we're not just talking about maintenance, but we're going to move to a concept of enhancement, and we're going to do that through outcomes. And so there'll be a new Section 7 of the Act which lists, I think there are 20 outcomes and there has been some critique of whether that approach will work, which I'll get to shortly. So the new draft Section 7, the Randerson panel didn't obviously draft the entire new legislation, but in an appendix to the back of the report they do have a go at drafting some of the key new sections, and one of those is Section 7, which is going to be the outcomes section. So that will include a requirement for people exercising functions and powers under the Act to provide for. So Section 7 currently doesn't have that new directive requirement, but the new one will. They must provide for the following outcomes, and there are a number of them, but relevantly we have the enhancement, so that's the focus on enhancement of features and characteristics that contribute to the quality of the natural environment. And there's, a key omission from my slide here, because there's the exact same phrase, that will contribute to the quality of the built environment. So that's where we're going to bring in some of those aesthetic considerations. And then we'll have not only the protection, but also the enhancement of our nationally and regionally significant features. And that'll include still the concepts of natural character and outstanding natural features and outstanding natural landscapes. And those of you with keen eyes will notice that they've broken down that comprehensive ONFL concept into separate features and separate landscapes, and that's probably in response to the case law that's developed around that. So as I mentioned, the Minister must identify and prescribe through national direction natural features and landscapes of national significance. Oh, hello, we've got a very active member of our audience here. So identify is a concept we're familiar with. Prescribe, I think, is an unusual word. It normally means make rules. But I suspect what's intended there is to also to describe or define. So we'll identify and then we'll describe and define. And then, of course, we're still going to have the regional layer. So regional councils must identify features of regional significance and regional spatial strategies. And that's another key area of reform that I don't have time to get into, but there will now be this requirement to develop a regional spatial strategy, and that will involve both the regional councils and the territorial authorities of a region that will together come up with one strategy, and that will be the document where our significant features are identified. Cultural landscapes is not a new thing, but it now will have a special place in the reforms. And these focus really on relationships. So the provision for relationships of mana whenua with cultural landscapes. So we're not talking about the Pākehā construct of culture, that's dealt with separately. This is for mana whenua. A definition has been suggested of cultural landscape, which is a defined area or place with strong significance for mana whenua, arising from cultural or historic associations, and includes connected natural, physical or metaphysical markers or features. And those words I've underlined just to emphasise that it is really about associations and relationships with things. And also, and I think this is quite groundbreaking in some ways, but there will be the recognition in the statute itself that this can involve a metaphysical concept, and we know that the case law certainly has recognised the idea of metaphysical things, but this will now be embedded in the legislation. And the panel really observed that this is about interconnections and about multifaceted relationships that mana whenua have with land and water. And there's also going to be an amendment to Section 6E provision, which you'll be familiar with, which is around the relationships of tangata whenua with their traditions, lands and taonga, and that will specifically include reference to cultural landscapes. And those with keen eyes will also have noticed that there will now be the reference specifically to iwi, hapu and whānau, rather than what we have at the moment, which is just reference to, well, there's a focus on iwi actually and iwi authorities, but now it's going to be much more inclusive, including hapu and whānau as well. So some early commentary, and this is really developed through discussions that I've had with a number of practitioners, and also the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton, delivered a salmon lecture, which I would commend to all of you. RMLA does an annual lecture, and he was the lecturer for 2021, and he provided some really interesting commentary and, quite frankly, critique about the Randerson report, and he had a number of quite fundamental concerns. And the first one was that the new purpose of the Act and this outcomes focus don't actually afford the natural environment a priority ranking. Now, Tony Randerson did subsequently respond to that critique, and he didn't accept that, and his point was that the new purpose will include a new concept of te mana o te taiao, so the mana essentially of the environment itself, and that concept is about prioritising our natural environment above all else. And so the idea is that if we don't have a healthy environment, then we don't have anything else. So he would argue that that is not correct. It is still giving essentially the natural environment a priority. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with the final wording of the legislation. Simon Upton and other commentators have also expressed a concern that because the legislation doesn't really clearly prioritise between these 20 different outcomes, that it may result in a return to a broad judgment approach. And I think Simon Upton's concern about that was we should be prioritising the environment, and obviously returning to the broad judgment approach might allow decision makers to allow built environment or economic considerations to trump environmental ones. But I think, and I'll get to this in a minute, but perhaps a different approach does apply for landscape, which really does involve judgment rather than just checkbox exercises, and so it may actually be appropriate to retain that element of discretion and judgment in a landscape context. There's also concern that conflicts between these outcomes and priorities are going to be left for the Minister to resolve through national direction, and whether that is appropriate, and certainly will be challenging for the Minister, I'm sure. The other concern, I think, is that then has a political element. So every 3 years, if we're going to have a different government, are they going to reassess and alter those priorities? And that a concern is that the courts will then have to reconcile those conflicts, and they'll go back to the purpose of the new Act, which doesn't prioritise the natural environment. And then finally, there's an interesting issue for landscape, I think, which is will New Zealand share a common view on what is nationally significant? And I did want to just refer you to some observations of Judge Kirkpatrick in the Matakana Island decision, which I was involved in, as well as a number of the landscape architects in the room. And he made some observations really around the idea of subjectivity, which I think as practitioners you will understand is a part of what you do. There's a subjective element of a landscape assessment as well as an objective element. But Judge Kirkpatrick observed that in relation to criticisms about this idea of subjectivity, and he said the making of value judgments is inherent in making laws, whether by Parliament enacting the RMA or by a council in making a plan under that Act. And he says the real issue lies in the extent to which the values of the law as implemented at the plan level are truly shared, on the basis that the subjectivity of people's individually held values can attain a level of objectivity where the extent to which those values are shared is able to be clearly demonstrated. So that's really a long way of saying that, this is what judges do, they like to use words, so do lawyers, that, you know, although there's a subjective element to things, you will still get a situation where something stands out so obviously from other things that there's really no need for an expert debate about something. So I personally don't think we need to be too concerned about whether it will be challenging to identify which of our landscapes are nationally significant. And I think the judge shared that view, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys as landscape practitioners think about that exercise. I know I'm talking like this legislation will happen or will happen in a way that reflects the Randerson Review Panel. And that is because there has been some pretty clear direction from MFE that at least for the exposure draft document, what's going to come out for consultation is going to look very similar to what the Randerson report recommends, and the Minister has said publicly that he's essentially picking that up and he's going to run with that at least as a starting point. So when you are getting together to look at what the reform might mean for you and your practices, while we wait for this draft to come out, you can rely on the Randerson panel's report. Existing jurisprudence, that's that fancy word again, and many of you in this room will have contributed to this, but we do have a really carefully considered and detailed body of landscape case law, particularly after the coastal policy statement and the avoid directions and what those mean. And the good news is that because we have a common law system in New Zealand, and that is really a case law system where you follow precedent, so one case needs to follow the other unless it can be distinguished on particular facts. You have this evolving body of law, and so what that will mean is that that law will remain relevant. You don't just throw it out because you've got new legislation, and you may have to distinguish certain parts of it where the new law is different, but it will still be very, very useful. So that amazing body of case law work that's also gone into your guidelines will still be incredibly valuable. Fundamental concepts won't change, so you're still going to have your concepts around identification of a landscape and protection being separate exercises, and that's the man of war jurisprudence, and other case law, important landscape case law will still be very relevant. And I did also note that the Randerson panel has sought to fix some issues that the case law has identified, so the case law has informed the legislation, and that feature in landscape distinction is one of those. So that was a really quick tour through the reform as it relates to landscape.